In our study of the life divine, we are in the chapter titled The Evolution of the Spiritual Man, where Sri Aurobindo is taking up the theme of the next step of human evolution from the mental consciousness to the spiritual. And in the portion we have just completed, he described the distinction between the mental and the spiritual. This is essential to our understanding because in the first emergence of the spiritual being out of the mental being, there is a heavy mixture and an enormous dependence on the mental being and the mind patterns. Even the spiritual appears to be almost as if a phenomenon of mind, a special turn of mind. But he says none of this is the true spirituality. And so he goes in detail describing what are the things: high intellectuality, idealism, ethical turn of mind, or ardent, exalted emotional fervor, mental belief, faith, emotional aspiration, formula of ethical or religious turns. All of these are excellent as a preparation, but they belong to the mental life proper. And they do not involve a true beginning of the spirituality. They are useful for disciplining, purifying, or giving a suitable form to the mental nature, which makes easier the emergence of the spiritual, but in themselves are not spiritual. And the beginning of spiritual realization is not there, he says. And in essence, we saw spirituality is the awakening of the inner reality of our being to spirit, self, or soul, which is other than mind, life, and body. Second, it is an inner aspiration to know, to feel, to be that, to enter into contact with the greater reality beyond, pervading the universe, inhabiting us. Third, it is to be in communion with it and union with it, a turning, a conversion, a transformation of our whole being as a result of this aspiration, contact, and union. And as a fourth step, a growth or waking into new becoming or new being, a new self, a new nature. And it is this fourth self which will complete the full emergence of the spiritual being as distinct from the mental being, which is as distinct from the vital being or the physical being. With this backdrop now, he moves forward with the character of the evolutionary emergence. And here comes an insight which you will not find anywhere else in any existing spiritual or religious tradition. First of all, just the factor of an evolution is somewhat new. Although it is implied in many traditions, it is not given the necessary importance that is due to it, which Sri Aurobindo gives to the whole theme of the spiritual evolution. But then into that, the character of a double evolution, you do not find anywhere described. Even if it is implied, at best it is left as a suggestion, but never taken up head on. And here Sri Aurobindo brings us to this awareness that in fact there is an outer evolution which nature has been driving, and there is an inner evolution of the soul which soul is driving, or the divine will in the soul. Equally, it is the divine will in nature which is driving the natural evolution, but the two are for a long time separate. And for a long time, the soul is dependent on the external machinery to sufficiently develop for it to be able to express itself. It may put out an influence, nudging, pushing, developing, but it is still dependent on that influence to now stabilize in a particular form. So Sri Aurobindo now takes up this theme of the double evolution and the relationship between the two for this next step from mind to spiritual consciousness. So we read the initial part of this paragraph last time. In fact, the creative consciousness force in our earth existence has to lead forward in an almost simultaneous process, but with a considerable priority and greater stress of the inferior element, a double evolution. So, first, who is leading this? The creative consciousness force, capital C, capital F, that is the divine consciousness as a force of impulse, which is pushing everything from within. In the Vedic tradition, this will be represented by the principle of Agni, which is the divine will embedded in matter, in all forms. And from the inconscience, it begins the whole movement of building forms and then developing the forms themselves, and at the same time inhabiting the forms and growing inside the forms. In the consciousness force, not in its liberated state above, but in our earth existence, it is that which is driving evolution. So from below, it has to lead forward in an almost simultaneous process. It's very interesting when Sri Aurobindo says almost or nearly, then you have to stop and ask why. So there has to be a simultaneous process. Why? Because, well, unless the outer nature develops sufficiently, the inner consciousness doesn't have a sufficiently receptive instrument. What if, in taking birth, by mistake, you had ended up in the body of a monkey? What would it be like in terms of your capacity to grow or to express yourself? And if, let's say, you're a conscious mental being inhabiting the body of a monkey, you would find yourself trapped because you want to express something, but the machinery of biology is unable to translate the impulse within you into form and speech. Perhaps even preventing you from being able to articulate a clear thought. You feel you know what you want to express, but boom, there's a block. That process of translating into clear, articulate, structured thought is already part of the development of the mental being. You will see this very often in human beings, and of course in children it is more obvious, but in adults you will see the same form. When we enter into argument to push forward what we want to say, often we find we don't know how to articulate it. We know what we want to say in an emotional mental construct. But when we move to words, this is important. That's all you can do. Shout louder, firmer, push harder. But why is it important? And at that point you see there is a process of mind which has to stand back, compare this with other things, articulate the differences, similarities, isolate the critical element of the difference, and then give to it the right word of vocabulary. It's not enough to say this is important. It's not enough to say this is great, this is wonderful. You have to be able to find the right word which says this is the basis for the success of that, and therefore this has to be our first focus. And then the mind of the other can then understand and translate into its own experience and change its perspective. But this ability to translate already requires a formed mental being which the ape does not have. And you will see this often in animals which are very close to the human transition, and often apes or dogs and cats who are very individualized. You can see that they're trying to think, but there's a struggle, there's a block. They're trying to express what they want to say. They're surprised. Why are you behaving like this? What is this strange thing? But they're unable to convert it. And at best, it takes an emotional impulse of bark or bite or some reaction. And this is the case with human beings also. When the mind has not been sufficiently developed. In children, it's obvious. I still have distinct memories, and all of us would have had such memories. As a child, you observe something in adult behavior and you find it odd, but you don't know how to translate it into words. And there is not even the ability to form. And the same thing as an adult, you are now able to articulate and argue out, or not, if it is not developed sufficiently. So there has to be, on the outside, this sufficient development, and then the soul can articulate or express itself. But on the other hand, how is the outside to grow if there is not the nudge from the soul? I want to express. You may have a highly developed intellect, body, but the soul is not sufficiently evolved to be able to make use of that. It is still evolved at a level of expression which is semi mind emotion. And it's no use. You will see this sometimes in families where the heredity has often formulated a certain type, a certain specialization, and instinctively the biology and the mind thinking moves in that groove. But if the soul is awake, it brings into it a dimension which is not there in the rest of the family. What makes for that distinctive character? The intention and impulse that the soul brings. And if the soul didn't bring that, you would just be living in that average, pointless, meaningless, mechanical, but distinctively of that character life. There's a very interesting observation one can make, and in India especially, if you go back to traditional units of community, there has been a mixture, but very recently, relatively. If you go back 50 years, maybe you begin to see mixtures across communities. But within the community, you find specializations. And the specializations often have a connection to what the community was involved in going back to skills, a couple of 100 years even. And so sometimes from the name you can make out, this must be of that type. And it's interesting to see how I was with a family which was developing precision electronic instruments. And I asked them, where did this come from? They said, we started it 10 years ago. What was your family doing before? Oh, we were never in electronics, of course. It's a new thing. What were they doing before? They were in precision furniture. Now you see the similarity. Making with precision, paying attention to tiny details, making perfect in matter, in form. And this now moves to a more sophisticated type. But the groove of type is interesting to observe. And sometimes it's quite amazing. In a particular community, I asked somebody who is pretty much an expert on these distinctions between communities. I said, what does that community type represent? And he said, and I knew the people there, so he said, this type is highly idealistic and they will sacrifice themselves to protect an ideal. And it was such a precise description of the people I knew in that community. And so you will find the specializations are quite distinct. In Europe, there has been a heavy mixture going back maybe 100 years or more. And sometimes you don't see the connection so easily. And there has been intermixture between families. But still in the more conservative types, you will see often connections in the lineage which make for a type of mind. But the question can be asked, what made for that specialization? What made that type move to a particular form of activity? Let's say in this case, the family moved to electronics. It could have taken something else. And there is always the push from within, the soul nudging and giving direction. And it has built up over time the outer form. Equally, the outer form built up is now available for the soul to take birth in. And so the two have to parallel. Both are interdependent in a way. So simultaneous process, but almost simultaneous. Why is it almost simultaneous? There's a slant. A considerable priority and greater stress of the inferior element in your nature. The nature has to be given a greater push by this creative consciousness force. Why? Because that's the slower part. That's the part which needs nature's push, and the soul push is not strong enough by itself. It can nudge if the instrument is sufficiently developed, but if the instrument is undeveloped, there's very little the soul can do. So there is an evolution of our outward nature, a nature of the mental being in the life and body. And there is within it pressing forward for self-revelation, because with the emergence of mind that revelation is becoming possible, a preparation at least, even the beginning of an evolution of our inner being, our occult, subliminal and spiritual nature. So first there is this outward evolution, and it is the nature of the mental being in the life and body. It is not the mental being in its free, liberated condition. It is as it is bound in life and body, which means it is highly embedded in life instinct impulses and the biological limitations, heaviness, inertia, and so on. Why is he taking trouble to point this out? Because the mental being free of life and body can be very different. For example, we have cases where somebody has a problem of personality, disorders they call them in today's psychology, psychiatry, personality disorders, sometimes even to the extreme where they can become unstable or lunatic or mad, as popularly said. But it represents a distortion in the vehicle and not in the consciousness of mind proper. So the same person in dream state, when out of the physical body, or when stepping out in and out of conscious, out of body experience, is completely conscious and cohesive in the thought, but re-entering the body plugs in into the vital and the physical machinery where the warp, the twist, the distortion is there. And it could come from the vital machinery, which has some insistent pull, push, bias, or distortion, or it can come in a physical damage, where in the nervous system there is some kind of a block. And this can be easily demonstrated if you inject in the bloodstream certain kinds of hormones, certain kinds of chemicals. The mind perspective changes. I remember watching a documentary of a person who underwent gender transition change. So it was a woman becoming a man, and so they had biological surgery which changed nothing except the biological form. But then the person was put through injections of hormones, and she describes how initially there was the shift, deepening of the voice, facial hair, and at some point she said, I wanted to cry but the tears wouldn't come. Very interesting description. And this is something which is the transition into the male physiology, temperament, emotion, mind complex, where a man can actually experience the full internal subjective experience of crying with no tear on the front. And literally, if you're conscious in your subtle body, you have the sense of some energy flowing out of your eyes. And the physical tears are actually a representation of that. And on the other extreme, if you go into the more feminine biological base of consciousness, there is the easy flow of tears, almost on a drop of a coin. And for a man, that's very disturbing, because for him the association of tears is with an extreme, and the woman will say, no, I feel relieved with the tear, that's it. And just this shift of pattern of behavior is controlled by that one hormone. You inject it, the pattern shifts this way, you inject another, it shifts that way. Has your mind changed? Has your mental body changed? It has only got as if warped, shaped by the emotional body, or the emotional impulse, which is rooted in the biology, and that's all that has changed. But it has a ripple effect in a massive shift of behavior. Equally, the thought processes shift, and there is a prioritization to an observer status, standing back, being less moved, less affected by things, all of which make for the typical temperament of the masculine or feminine tendencies. But this is to show that the liberated mental body, separated from the biology, floating in an out-of-body experience or dream state, can be quite free and clear in its particular type. When it re-embeds itself, it finds itself again twisted, warped, fitted into this mold. And so what he is describing here is this: an evolution of our outward nature, the nature of the mental being in the life and body. This is what is being shaped, not the mental nature in its free poise in the mental body. It is this shaping here that's taking place. And because it is here that the full power of the mental being has now to be brought in. And if the mind is in its true nature free and clear, it has to be able to bring that freedom and clarity into the mind-body life complex. And separate. There is within it pressing forward for self-revelation, a preparation, at least even the beginning of an evolution of our inner being. So this inner thing, which is conscious enough, is pushing forward. But then comes this parenthetical statement: with the emergence of mind, that revelation is becoming possible. Now he's describing the state of humanity in general today. If you go back, let's say a few thousand years, when the mind was not sufficiently developed and coming into its own, where the mental being was still largely emotionally formed, you could not have had the necessary receptacle of mind sufficiently developed for this full spiritual possibility to come forward. It is in such an evolutionary condition of the collective humanity that we see the necessity for symbolic forms of the spirit. And that's why all the religious rituals and forms and symbolisms were necessary. Even in the Vedic training, you see two forms. One is the form given to the elite, the rishi, or those who are in readiness to grow into a higher mental and spiritual consciousness, where the experience directly developed is the form. But then to the common mass, which is not yet able to inhabit this consciousness or move freely into a higher spiritual form, what they are capable of is given to them, and often it takes a form of an external symbol or ritual. You are not, perhaps because your mind is not yet clear and stable in its clarity of awareness, you are not able to become conscious directly of the divine presence. So you can feel it in your emotional mental complex. And so it takes certain forms of an emotional turn or of an external ritual and symbolic representation of those things. And this double language was necessary because of the gap between the elite who have the spiritual experience and the mass who are not yet fully capable of entering into it directly. That phase has passed. Largely, we can say, for the mass of humanity, the development of the mind has taken place sufficiently that one can now begin to enter directly into that experience. And so, he says, with the emergence of mind, that revelation is becoming possible. It's not yet fully established. You still find parts of humanity which are semi-mentally developed. But in The Life Divine, in one of the earlier chapters, he points out how what we see is even from communities which have been largely undeveloped in mental terms, living very close to instinctive, impulsive values, coming from certain tribal structures often. You see within 2 or 3 generations of exposure to the power of thought that they come into full power of mental clarity and intelligence, which was not there otherwise in the culture. And in 2 or 3 generations, evolution cannot do it unless there has already been a prior preparation of this. And so he actually uses this as an example to point out that in fact in the past there has been an attempt to rise through the intellectual mind into the intuition, and even an entry into the intuition was made, but the intellectual mind was not sufficiently developed and there was a relapse. And so now we are as if catching up with what was developed. The relapse required an integration of something higher into the lower, and now we are developing once again. And this is the reason he explains why within 2 or 3 generations you can pick up this very high intellectual, even abstract thought power. But as that grows, the pressing forward for self-revelation of the inner being becomes possible. even the beginning of an evolution of our inner being, our occult, subliminal, and spiritual nature. 3 phrases he has used: inner being, occult, subliminal, and spiritual nature. And they are, in a sense, sequential. Inner being is that part which is inhabiting this outer personality. And so, generally, it's a general term of the inner pushing forward its influence. And then occult, subliminal, that which is secret, which is hidden behind the layers. In fact, in our subliminal inner mind, inner vital, or even inner physical, much greater powers of consciousness are waiting to emerge. All those powers are now included in this emergence. And then the true spiritual nature, which is at the core of it all, that coming forward. So these are 3 things, quite distinct, and yet they're bound to each other intimately. You cannot enter the spiritual unless the subliminal is passed as a passage and the inner being is sufficiently active. All these are pushing forward. The result, though, of this is that often we see spontaneously in young children something of these things pushing forward, and with no obvious element of the parental or educational turn. It doesn't mean it always lasts. Often these things get covered up. But to find increasingly in the young children the emergence of these things is sign that nature is pushing, that she is developing this. But nature's major preoccupation must necessarily be still, and for a long time, the evolution of mind to its greatest possible range, height, subtlety. For only so can be prepared the unveiling of an entirely intuitive intelligence, of overmind, of supermind, the difficult passage to a higher instrumentation of the spirit. So now he is describing what's going to happen. Let's fast forward a few hundred years, and this is the direction that it will take. Nature's major preoccupation, and that is, remember what Sri Aurobindo has described as the unconscious yoga of nature. In the mass, where there is not a conscious effort to develop consciousness or higher possibilities, nature is pushing. And in that, her major preoccupation will still necessarily be this. That means the spiritual will be there. She will look at it and push that also, but her major focus is here. And for a long time, in evolutionary terms, that can even mean a few thousand years for the masses. The evolution of mind to its greatest possible range, height, subtlety. And the reason for this is that the unveiling of the intuitive intelligence of overmind and supermind needs an instrument which is able to receive it. Now you can have an intuition which is developed with a semi-developed mind. And what is interesting is the mind will have insights, but it will not have the ability to articulate with clarity or go into precision or represent the full complexity of what the intuition knows. You will see often, this is the case with many great saints. You ask them highly technical questions and they give very simple answers. They give analogies from their environment. An excellent example is Ramakrishna Paramahansa. He would be asked difficult questions and he would draw examples from his world, which was a very simple farming community space where everything is very close to nature. And often, for example, an analogy will be the way water takes any form depending on the shape of the jug. So consciousness takes the form depending on the shape of the personality or nature. Examples like this, which are so obvious and sometimes so profound, that they seem to suggest so much more as implications. But that's where it stops in the articulation. Now, if the receiver has a more subtle mind, he catches the other nuances which may come, or he may not. But it's accessible to everybody as a first step. But it stops there. What you find instead in the example of Sri Aurobindo is this very rich, detailed, complex, multifaceted, multi-structured, hierarchical and yet deeply intuitional articulation of an experience. You don't find that anywhere. You will not find equivalent literature in the world, spiritually literature. You will find legal literature which may do an analysis of a constitution or some particular situation with that kind of complexity and detail, and that's the power of the mind. But then to be able to articulate with that kind of complexity and detail a spiritual experience, well, it's not been done so far. Even in the Veda, what you have, all these things are articulated using symbols. But the mental articulation with this kind of structured clarity of thought, no, it's an intuitional expression. And Sri Aurobindo, Kapali Shastriya once explained it to Panditji. He said, Sri Aurobindo represents the highest developed mind so far in human evolution. But he's not just that, he's much more. But the mind itself as a vehicle is the highest developed. And what happens is in the very act of reading and studying his writing, you find your mind begins to get shaped into this kind of richness and complexity. And he is literally imprinting it. And that's the power of the intuitive and spiritual consciousness. But using the vehicle of a logical, structured mind. So, if the intuitive intelligence has to be manifested, it doesn't need a richly developed mind. It can still manifest. But if it has to manifest entirely what it brings, then you need the vehicle of mind which is such. So what are the requirements for the mind to be a capable instrument for all this higher possibility, to work through it? Greatest possible range of mind, greatest possible height of mind, greatest possible subtlety of mind. The three different facets of the mental development. Think about what that means. Range has the sense of a horizontal expanse. You notice in the mind as it used to be, going back a couple of decades, couple of centuries, there would be often depth of training, but not width. So each one specialized in his own particular area, and that was considered a great thing. Today, the turn of mind, instinctively, even in children, because of the push of nature, by the way, is widening, horizontal. I want to know a little bit about everything, and I don't care to go into detail. And this is the first sign that this push, greatest possible range, is nature's first preoccupation. She has not yet got into height and subtlety. It's just range that she is focusing upon. And you notice little children today have been exposed to a wide variety of ideas, and often quite complex and rich. Not that they can embody them, but they've been exposed to, and that's just made the sense of mind more wide. If the mind is capable, it has also become a little more rich by this exposure. And it's almost as if through media, through the internet, this possibility is being pushed into the younger generation by the impulse of nature. But how far can it go? Literally, if you could expose yourself to every kind of knowledge system of specialization, every field of knowledge, and the particular turn of mind which makes that field of knowledge capable of mastery. You see, the turn of mind of an artist is very different from the turn of mind of a scientist who is much more analytical. But within the scientist, the engineering mind is very different from the exploratory and speculative mathematical mind. The mathematical mind is very different from the applied physics mind, because mathematical can get into speculation. Let's conceive of millions of universes of different kinds and imagine how they could be organized, and structures possible of organization of universes. And the applied physics just goes to what works. And out of that, the engineering mind, how do I build it? But it's not going to get into speculation. Obviously, if there is a mind which can span all three domains, he can conceive, articulate, and turn into action. And such a person would be most effective, most successful. But to do that is not easy, because one lifetime is not enough to develop one type of mind. Often we have developed specializations of mind, pushing a particular narrow band to its full, and then another and another. And at some point, the soul takes up multiple facets and tries to integrate and organize them to make for one rich type. There's an interesting observation that Sri Aurobindo makes, which is noted by Pavitrada. He came as a scientist from one of the elite schools of Paris, and coming with a scientific mind, Sri Aurobindo was assisting him to open to the intuitive. And Sri Aurobindo explained how the turn of mind of an occultist is very different from the turn of mind of a scientist. And then Pavitra notes from memory, Sri Aurobindo says, it goes something like this: it is without doubt that one who can integrate both these types of mind will lead science to great discoveries. Something like that. And you can imagine what that would require. Because the turn of the occultist is to perceive directly underlying symbolic truths and their analogies and links across levels, whereas the turn of the scientist is to literally cut up and break up and try to go to some specialization. How do you manage to bridge these two? Well, it has to be done. And if you can do it, then the intuition now establishing itself into the mind and awakening in mind its own greater powers would have the full spectrum of play, at least in width. And then comes the second aspect of the play, greatest possible height. What does it mean, height of mind? So I gave an example already of how the mind can rise into abstraction. In the abstraction of mathematics, the mind rises to more and more essential terms, essential ideas, until at some point it gets so high up that it has almost no correspondence to physical experiences. For example, just as a very quick sense of how it could go, conceive of every possible particle, let's say, in space. Conceive of every possible direction each particle could move. Now you have already a picture, each particle moving in all possible directions. Conceive of every possible intensity in each direction that the particle could move. Okay? You have some sense of that? And now conceive of all possible directions and intensities in this direction as distinct from that direction, as distinct from that direction, as being separated in different groups. So all particles moving in this direction is one group, all particles in that direction, each is like a set, a collection. Okay? And then each unique direction and intensity within each becomes as if a vector. That's what we define as a vector. Now you see how the level of abstraction, complexity, sophistication of the mind, and if you could follow it through, okay, and what's the point of it, you'll say. But to the mind which is now into this, it says, wow, wonderful. A vector is defined not as a point moving in a direction with an intensity, but all possible points moving in a direction with an intensity. And all possible points in all direction, in all intensities, makes for the totality of what we will call vector space. Very interesting concept. And what is interesting is, if you conceive now of vector space purely, from vector space you will come back to this space of points and forces. They are as if complementary ideas to each other. All possible functions. And so the mind can build like this levels of abstraction. We build infinities. Conceive of a series of dots infinitely. No end. And then add one more. Can you do that? Difficult, because you see the infinity going out into infinity. Now think of it in this way. You see how the mind plays flexibly. Take one step, then half a step, then half of half, quarter step, 1/8 step, 1/16 step. Keep taking half and half steps. Keep going infinitely. Where will you end up? If you reach the infinity count, you will end up at the second step. Now you have a picture which is within your physical space. So you can conceive of infinity of dots in a series, within your 2 steps. Okay? Now put 1 step after. So here's your infinity plus 1. Interesting? Now notice in the mathematics how the mind speculates. All of these treat each of these steps as houses. And now you have clients who come, guests who come to live in your houses. Here's your hotel of an infinity of rooms. And you just have an infinity of people who have come in. They lodge infinitely, no problem. And now a new person comes. What do? Can you house him? Here's the interesting thing. You tell each person in your infinite hotel, can you shift to the next room, please? And the new person is lodged in the first room. No problem. So you can add more and more people infinitely. So you have an infinity hotel with infinity of guests, and you've just brought in an infinity of more guests, and there's place for everybody. You see now, somewhere the mind starts balking. We are used to thinking in finites, to think in terms of infinites. In infinities, you can add any number to the infinite and you'll still have the same infinite, the same hotel room structure. So, any number plus infinity is the same infinity. Keep on adding, no problem. Keep on pouring. It still takes it in. Within this picture which you have of 2 feet. Interesting. But now remember, we did 1 step after. Infinity plus 1 represents a new level, a new paradigm, as if a new grade of, and from there you start counting 1, 2, 3, 4 into infinity. And then you accumulate infinity plus infinity plus infinity, and it makes as if a new level of an infinity. And so there are ways, you see how the mind is building realities which have no physical correspondence anymore. But they have a vivid mental reality. They do represent realities of the mind consciousness and could be symbolically represented in the physical world, but otherwise they don't exist in the physical world. But to the mind space, so much more is possible. In fact, you have hierarchies of infinities going out into infinity of hierarchies. And in fact, mathematics comes to the concept of the absolute by looking at the chain of these hierarchy of infinities. Where does that end? It doesn't end again. But the sum total of all these infinities is the absolute omega. And that's how mathematics actually through the mind glimpses the infinite. Amazing. But you could train your mind not only to get familiar with these things, but to begin to live in this kind of a world of rarefication of thought. So height takes another form. I've taken a more mathematical approach to this. But the implications of this, the way you start looking at the universe, actually is beginning to approach the way the divine looks at things. And so there's a mathematical theorem. Now remember, we are thinking in terms of infinites, not in finites. Take an apple, cut it up into slices. How many? You make 4 slices, 8 slices. Let's make an infinity of slices. Obviously, you can't do it physically, but you can do it in your mind. Okay? Or an infinity of layers, peel off layers, an infinity of them. Now take the sun, which is so much bigger, and slice it into an infinite slices, or layered infinity of layers. Okay, in your mind you've done it. Apple, small, sun, big, infinity of layers. Notice you can map each layer or each slice of the apple to one slice or one layer of the sun. Exactly 1 to 1. Nothing is lost. In other words, and this is the theorem in mathematics, you could take the sun, dismantle it, so to say, slice it into an infinite parts, and then rejoin it in a way that it becomes the size of an apple, and nothing would be lost. This is true in the mind space, in the nature of mind's perception of reality. Isn't it? You can see, you can perceive this. This is how the divine sees things. To the divine, the sun and the apple are equivalent. They're equally important, equally large or small. From the consciousness that lives in the infinite, the perception of the finite is totally different. Everything is equally important, although differently formed. The infinity perceives itself in all finite appearances. This is the divine's way of looking at it. And mathematics actually rising in its rarefied state is approaching the perception of the divine. Interesting. You could, in fact, through mathematical symbols and such training of the mind, begin to perceive things through the mind the way the divine sees it. And if the mind has been so trained to so look at the world, when the intuition begins to fill the mind, it has a ready instrument through which to manifest its infinity and its view of the world through the infinity consciousness. Isn't it? Otherwise, it has to take your limited, finite habit of mind thinking and kind of stretch it, expand it, and teach it to begin to see through the infinite. And while you may have the experience of the infinite, you don't have the power to articulate, because it's not, the mind has not been made flexible or high to be able to articulate this. But if it has been prepared, this would be wonderful for the descending consciousness. Of course, it can go two ways. From below you can prepare, it takes time. Or from above you bring the experience, and now the infinite consciousness pouring in shapes. If the mind is flexible enough, if the mind is subtle enough. So that brings you to the third aspect. Greatest possible subtlety. And subtlety, you could see it in two ways. It responds to the tiniest nuance, recognizes tiniest suggestion. It's a kind of a receptivity to tiny shifts and differences. In the same way as we have subtlety to the touch, a skilled person can touch surface of cloth and tell you what type it is, and perhaps even where it was manufactured or which company manufactured it, because of the distinctiveness of it. A musician listening to a violin play can say, this is one of those old models, Stradivarius. It has that particular rich tonality. And someone who is a neophyte will say, how do you make out? But the same thing happens in the character of thought itself and the subtlety with which thought looks at nuances of ideas. See, when Sri Aurobindo throws in this word, nature's major preoccupation must necessarily be still, and for a long time, the evolution of mind. Pause on the word major. Sri Aurobindo uses the word major preoccupation. And what would be the nuance if that word was replaced by significant preoccupation? Major preoccupation, significant preoccupation. Can your mind distinguish the nuance? Interesting. And if you have not trained yourself to appreciate nuances of words, it's a surprise. Oh yes. But if you have trained yourself, immediately the mind catches the subtle suggestion that comes with each nuanced word. A skilled writer is not just one who is able to get you into a narration, but who is able to catch these fine nuances and maybe even bring in a certain power using a particular nuanced word. All this is part of the mind's development, still not sufficiently developed in the masses, which is necessary. Now imagine if our educational system was rethought from this perspective, to train the mind to actually develop its greatest possible range, height, subtlety. Interesting. We would make it ready for this higher spiritual possibility to. For only so can be prepared the unveiling of an entirely intuitive intelligence. Otherwise, it will be partially intuitive, not entirely. And so the mind has to be trained and rarefied to its highest possibility until it can open out to a direct contact with the intuition, descending and filling it. Now, this is something which you will recall in the Synthesis of Yoga. Sri Aurobindo describes 4 exercises for developing the intuitive mind. First, teaching the mind to become silent and remain silent. Second, to shift the center of thought above head, which brings it closer to the center of intuition, free of the brain and free of brain fatigue. Third, to wait for the initiation of any action or thought from the intuitive consciousness rather than your mental will. And then the fourth is to precisely develop all the faculties of your mind to their highest rarefied extreme, where they as if exceed the limits of mind itself and now begin to join with the intuition. And that's when literally the intuition plugs in and flows through. such a richly developed mind with range, height, subtlety. And this is what nature wants to do in the mind of humanity. And this is her program immediately. And whether it takes a few hundred years or a few thousand years for the rest of the mass of humanity doesn't matter, but she's pushing it. But already, for those who have a natural inclination to become more aware in mind, nature is able to accelerate this development. And for those of us who are reading Sri Aurobindo, if we make the effort to now keep this perspective, Sri Aurobindo is teaching our mind to become wide, teaching it to perceive from poise of height, teaching it the subtlety and nuanced perception and thought. You can enormously accelerate and perhaps achieve in a few years what otherwise might take a few lives of sustained effort. For only so, no other way, only so can be prepared the unveiling of an entirely intuitive intelligence of overmind, of supermind, the unveiling of overmind and of supermind. Why? Overmind in its very nature is a consciousness of infinity. So it's not enough that you have intuitive eyes, you have to also acquire the infinity. And if overmind, a single thought of the overmind is infinite, and your mind has to become a vehicle for its expression, unless your mind is habituated to seeing vast, large, embracing thought, it's not going to be a ready or fit instrument. It will necessarily reduce or break up the overmental thought into many pieces. And of course, supermind is not only infinite, it is oneness in infinity, which requires the mind to cease to break up entirely. It must be able to hold, literally lose itself into the oneness and yet be able to articulate without losing the oneness. And that's why he says, the difficult passage to a higher instrumentation of the spirit. So, mind is going to be literally driven out of its limitations until it ceases to become mind as we know it. Sri Aurobindo, not in the Life Divine, but in his last few articles, speaks of how this transition could take place in what he has called the mind of light, where something of this higher consciousness is able already to seize upon our existing mind and awaken in it the ability to know without error, although within limitation. It doesn't free from limitation, but it frees from error. And so, as if the intuition entering the mental consciousness awakens into it the light of intuition, and progressively from there, this mind of light would grow into wideness, richness, depth, subtlety, and so on. Each time representing a higher gradation of consciousness through the intuition, through the overmind, through the supermind. But it allows already the mind as it is to begin to be a vehicle for the expression of the spirit without distorting, without perverting. Otherwise, if there has not been this sufficient awakening, anything that the spirit brings in, the mind is going to limit, distort, warp, or break up, or cloud, darken, etc. So this is nature's immediate preoccupation, the major preoccupation. If, he says, the sole intention were the revelation of the essential spiritual reality and the cessation of our being into its pure existence, this insistence on the mental evolution would have no purpose. So now he's bringing a different perspective to this question. And this is in answer to those who say, well, why are you even wasting time to train your mind? Mind is your instrument of ignorance and limitation. Get out of mind, kill mind, silence it in order to kill it. And so much of human effort in the spiritual domain is really spent for that. And he says, this would be relevant, human mental evolution would have no purpose, if the goal of this evolution was only to reveal the spiritual reality and get us to merge into that, cease to exist here and merge into that existence, then why waste time? You don't need to read books, you don't need to study, you don't need to enlarge your powers of mind. Just keep doing that. How do you get out of it? He explains that. For at every point of the nature, there can be a breaking out of the spirit and an absorption of our being into it. An intensity of the heart, a total silence of the mind, a single absorbing passion of the will would be enough to bring about that culminating movement. Easy to do. Just bring in that intensity and persist. And you have 3 points he describes. Intensity of the heart, I want, and you dedicate yourself until you lose yourself into it. Total silence of the mind. Kill mind, doesn't matter. But from there, single absorbing passion of the will, and it would bring about that culmination. So he says, the point being, there can be a breaking out of the spirit and an absorption of our being into it from any point of the nature. In our evolution, in our parts of consciousness, levels of consciousness, from anywhere you can break out. And this is the point which many do not understand. When somebody has had an experience of breaking out and an experience of spirit or even of self, generally, it does not mean you have risen in your evolution. It simply may mean you have got out from where you are. And you could get out on many levels. And depending on which level you get out of, that's the level from which you perceive the self. And then you would perceive it differently because your power of perception is limited to the level at which you are. This, in fact, is the point Sri Aurobindo makes of the distinction between the approach of the Buddha and of Adi Shankaracharya, or his own approach. The Buddha entered the perception of the self through mind. How does mind know anything? By comparing with other things, by cutting up things and separating into pieces and rejoining. That's your only way to know. So when you approach the absolute, how do you compare it with anything? There is no other thing to compare with. There is no thing itself. And the absolute is not a thing. So you can't. How can you cut it up? How can you join? You can't. So what is the absolute to this perception? Nothing. And so it is emptiness. It is extinction into emptiness that is described. And that's the grade of entry to self through mind. Shankaracharya enters from a poise of an intuitional consciousness. How does the intuition know things? By experiencing identity with it. And so Shankaracharya experiences identity with the self and experiences delight. Sat, Chit, Ananda. But the intuitional consciousness is not the consciousness of unity. And so to the intuition which has identified with the self, there is still the world that remains against that self-experience. The world seems almost superficial, ephemeral, unreal. And so reality is divided because intuition is not a complete knowledge. It looks at one thing, looks at another thing, but sees them still differently. Sri Aurobindo's approach is to know the self the way the self knows itself, by its power of cognition, not the mind, not the intuition, which are inferior powers. And so it is, of course, you can approach through each of these, but know that you're only perceiving an aspect of self. But ascend in your power of cognition until the power of self to know itself, which is the supermind, is your way to experience self. And then you know all these experiences as aspects of it, but you know it and world as one. And the whole perception and the experience and the purpose of life, of course, is differently seen. The point being, you can get out at any level. And if the goal was to get out, none of this evolutionary development would be necessary, which is typically what you're taught in many of the current Vedantic systems. And so the point that nature is pushing towards this forward, this evolution, is evidence that those goals are not nature's intention. If nature's final intention were otherworldly, then too the same law would hold. For everywhere, at any point of the nature, there can be a sufficient power of the otherworldly urge to break through. and away from the terrestrial action and enter into a spiritual elsewhere. So, if the goal was otherworldly meaning, you have to now recognize that the physical world is a world of ignorance, and the aim of life is to enter into some subtle reality, a subtle physical domain, or some higher reality. In certain Buddhist traditions, they speak of living in the rainbow body and entering into that world. Or in certain esoteric traditions of Christianity, they will speak of abandoning this world to enter into a subtler grade where you do not have this domain of suffering or ignorance. In some of the Mayan practices, similarly, there is this idea that through certain processes, you'll finally get out of and live in the subtle body, in a subtle domain, which would be wonderful. And so, ayahuasca and such drugs are your gateway, so to say, to make that transition. But the goal still is otherworldly. And same point, he says, you can get out at any level. In fact, this is what happens when you take drugs. You are basically exposed to the universal consciousness of that grade at which you are at. And suddenly you find yourself, I'm free of this body, I'm one with the universe. I've experienced oneness, I've experienced spirituality. No, it's not spiritual. In the very definition, as we've seen earlier, it is not spiritual. But it is a glimpse of a universality on that level. And that's why the state in which you enter the drugs makes a huge difference. You enter in it in a consciousness that lives in a lower vital, fear-based habit. You open out to the lower vital domain where you experience terrorizing experiences. Or if the skilled practitioner helps you turn to your higher aspiration, you have glimpses of the higher. So I was once present in a group. Unfortunately, they believed that they were entering spiritual domains. They had some Mayan person who was about to give them little pills to enter into what they thought was spirituality. I happened to be there, and out of politeness, I couldn't say that I'd rather not be here. But I said, okay, I'll sit, but I will do my own thing. So I saw what the Mayan practitioner did. He asked each one, what is it you're seeking for? What is your aspiration? And there was a Buddhist lady there. She spoke of her ideal. And so after she took the drug, the mind was turned in that direction, and she was blabbering for a while. I have seen the seventh heaven of the Buddha. I have seen the seventh heaven. It is so wonderful. Oh. And of course, she was unable to control herself, and somebody was patting her. And I said, what seventh heaven is this? Unfortunately, it was a glimpse of one of those vital worlds, which can be extremely beautiful and intoxicating and attractive, but that's all it is. And once the effect of the drugs passed, that's all there was. But the atmosphere of the room had dropped to such a low, thick, sticky level. I would not have normally stayed if it was not out of sheer politeness. But I got out of it as soon as I could politely. I said, I have to leave, it's late, thank you. And that was it. But it was getting lower and lower. But I could see what each one was in their own state, and some of them who were habituated to it were wandering in their worlds and seeing colors and lights, moving their hands. And then what? But in that state, momentarily, the boundaries of a physical limiting consciousness have been dimmed. Not removed, but dimmed. And so you have this experience. And in this way, with or without drugs, one could at any point get out of the physical domain into some otherworldly poise. Again, there's no point for evolution if this is the goal. But if her intention is a comprehensive change of the being, this double evolution is intelligible and justifies itself. For it is for that purpose indispensable. Very simply, comprehensive change of the being. That means in the evolution, not only you awaken to higher levels of consciousness, but your entire being undergoes an entire overhaul. Nothing left untouched. Nothing left fully recast in the shape of this new consciousness. Nothing not left fully recast in this. And so this double evolution is makes sense, it is justified, but also it is indispensable. You have to work on this. So now here we are, that is the end of the paragraph. Here we are, with this awareness, what do we do with our lives? We have a spiritual goal, but we understand also nature's goal requires an external development of the mind, even of our vital being, of our physical consciousness, all three, to be lifted up into greatest possible range, height, subtlety, at least for mind, and its equivalent terms in the vital and even in the physical consciousness. So let's be clear that if we wanted to change our physical consciousness, we have no other means to do it except through the mind. Why? You're not conscious of your body. You are only conscious of your mind's perception of your body through the machinery that the body offers to link to the mind, which is your nervous system. If you were directly conscious of your body, you would feel your bones. You don't. You can only feel the bones when you get a knock and there is a pain, but the pain is the nerves registering, not the bone itself that you register. So your mind is your only tool even to change the body. It's your only tool even to change your emotions and life energies. You have a drive of life force, but until the drive pops up and makes you do something, you're not even conscious of what the drive is or where it came from. You're not conscious of the intense, complex play of urges, pulls, pushes, instincts, passions inside, until they cross a certain threshold and pop up into your mental awareness. Sometimes they make you do something, you react, you say a harsh word, and at that point you become conscious that you've said it. And then you try to control, restrain, modify. And there's your key. Your mind gets awareness when the thing comes up, but then once it has got awareness, it can begin to follow the movement to its source, or as far as it can to the source. It can begin to modify the surface behavior, and through that modify the deeper. It's an out to in process by the mind. But you can, and even in the physical body, although you are not directly conscious, you can register indirectly through the nervous system and the mind's identification and begin to work on it. And you have an understanding which allows you to make the body more supple, more conscious, and so on. But it is through mind that you will infuse awareness into body and into emotions. This is critical. This is your link point. Mind turning down, and separately, the same mind turning up towards the higher intuition and the spirit. And if it has done both, it becomes the link point. Sri Aurobindo explains the role of our intellect is as a link point to the spirit. And it now allows the spirit to enter through the mind's awareness, and where mind's awareness has penetrated life and body, the spirit can flow through. It can still flow through otherwise, but it's a slower work. Where it has access through mind, it can flow through directly and act directly. And so this is our immediate priority in the work. Two directions. One, turning of our consciousness and everything within us to put it in relation to the divine in the simplest, most direct manner possible, as completely as possible. And the other, to turn that same consciousness towards the rest of our being, not only mind, but emotions, life energies, and the physical body itself. Either to train, develop, or to, as a link point of awareness, invoke, infuse something of that higher influence. If mind alone takes up the development, you have significant results. But if mind becomes a vehicle for the higher influence to flow through, you have dramatic results. And sometimes the results can be so dramatic as to appear miraculous. But link point is still your mental awareness. So here we have seen now the importance of the double evolution. But the problem of double evolution is that the moment the higher begins to engage with the lower, it gets stuck with the processes of the lower. And this is the theme now that he takes up in the next paragraph. This, however, imposes a difficult and slow spiritual advance. For First, the spiritual emergence has to wait at each step for the instruments to be ready. How can the spiritual consciousness evolving internally articulate itself unless the outer has caught up? And necessarily, at least at our human stage, the possibility of the spiritual evolution can be much more rapid. And the biology has struggled keeping up. Next, as the spiritual formation emerges, it is mixed inextricably with the powers, motives, impulses of an imperfect mind, life, and body. So, as this spiritual, he's used this word formation, the form in which the spiritual being is now organizing and developing internally, pushing forward now and entering mind, life, body, it gets sucked into its powers, motives, impulses on this imperfect machinery. And he goes into some detail of what they are. I skip that. We'll see it in detail later. Or maybe I'll just read through. There is a pull on it to accept and serve these powers, motives, and impulses, a downward gravitation and perilous mixture, a constant temptation to fall or deviate, at least a fettering. That is, you have shackled, you're bound. A weight, a retardation. And as a consequence, he says, there is a necessity to return upon a step gained in order to bring up something of the nature which hangs back and prevents a farther step. So each time you have made one step, you have to actually go back and see all the steps which are currently stuck at a lower level and raise them up. And again you are able to make one step in the inner and again have to dig down all the other levels, pull them up suitably. And each step of the rung of the ladder, you're not leaving behind the rest. You have to turn back upon the rest and lift it up to make it aligned to the higher step. Finally, now this is the fourth difficulty. Finally, there is by the very character of the mind in which it has to work, a limitation of the emerging spiritual light and power, and a compulsion on it to move by segments, to follow one line or another, and altogether to leave altogether or leave till later an achievement of its own totality. Remember, mind has specialized forms, approaches, temperaments, types. So if the infinite wants to express itself through the mind, well, the mind is only going to develop one side first, then another, and in pieces. And how do you integrate them? It's difficult for the mind to do that. So these are four broad difficulties which are imposed for the spiritual emergence to take place by the very nature of this outer being. Now, I want to pause here because we'll look at each of these difficulties and their character in some detail next time. The fact that Sri Aurobindo takes pains to mention all these in detail when he speaks of powers, motives, impulses, downward gravitation, perilous mixture, we need to look at what they are, because to become conscious of them in us helps. You're conscious, this is what is happening, you can then correct for it more easily. Otherwise, I don't know what's happening, but each time that there is this descent, this happens. There's a revolt, there's a reaction, I fall sick. Why? Well, become conscious. And here is a full roadmap in rich detail of all the things. And of course, as a lawyer, he gives all the possibilities, nothing is left out. And that's the brilliance of the perception. It's complete and yet summarized sufficiently that it doesn't become too long. Catches in essence all the tendencies. But the first problem is that the spiritual emergence has to wait at each step for the instruments to be ready. What we will see later, and we'll conclude the discussion with this, is that the spirit has a greater power to change than the mind has, or even nature pushing from below. And so the method he will describe is, rather than struggling with this change, you first focus on developing, deepening the consciousness within. When you have developed and awoken there, bring the power of that into this instrumentation. And that greater power can change it more rapidly than nature can. And yet what you're doing is not contrary to nature, you're aligning, assisting. Or, to put it in a different vocabulary, but the same idea, instead of relying on lower nature to push from below, we open ourselves to the divine nature, to the divine Shakti, to the divine power, for her to act from above, to do the same thing which lower nature is doing much more slowly and with difficulty. And she from above can enter and lift and change much more rapidly, transform rapidly. But the map which he gives is still useful for us to understand. We could ignore the map completely and say, well, I open myself, and eventually whatever difficulties are there, they will be taken care of. But if you're conscious of all these nuances, then you will recognize some of them in your temperament as having a significant role. And then those problems themselves you could consciously turn and open to the action of the divine Shakti, and thereby rapidly overcome. I want to share here an unusual research which I was recently exposed to, which has great value in what we are discussing. When he says that spiritual emergence has to wait at each step for the instruments to be ready. And a lot of the problems are really of the physical instrument. And the basis of the physical instrument of the body is in our genetics. If the spiritual effort, as we saw, were to be done in a monkey body, it would be so much more difficult because the link point of mind is not sufficiently developed. But so much of our body is still monkey body, isn't it? It would suggest that perhaps along with this spiritual awakening into Homo sapiens, and perhaps now a transition from Homo sapiens into Homo divinicus, if we may call it, a divine humanity, there would be a reflection of the change in the biological, let's say, receptivity or responsiveness or subtlety and sensitivity. You see, one of the first things that happens when you take to the spiritual life, you suddenly become much more conscious and therefore much more sensitive. And things which earlier didn't bother you, you are now conscious of them and you begin to register. And then you have to develop the equality or the resilience or the strength. But still, the first thing is a sensitization. Would it not be worthwhile if the physical biology itself had sufficiently evolved in its genetic makeup or epigenetic content that it was already conscious, it was already receptive, it was already responsive to the pressure of the higher consciousness as it is to the mind? And why not? And here's the interesting thing. So, the research which I was exposed to was from a group at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. They were doing a study to see whether there is a genetic component to people who have psychic abilities. Now, this is not directly spiritual, but still at least an opening to some inner subliminal occult dimension. And for that purpose, they had to isolate people from people who claim they have psychic abilities from people who don't have. And that's your control group. And then within those who have claim to psychic abilities, they had to go through and see if there was some hereditary component. Whether your parents had it or someone, one of your parents or grandparents had it. Because they were looking for a genetic strain which would be common to all of them. So, starting with I think 600 or 700 people, they began through this process of elimination, and interestingly, they came down, I believe, to 8 or 14, I don't remember the number, but something in that range. All of them were women. So the chief scientist for the project, he said, maybe there's something to it, that women are the carriers for this genetic component, or they tend to be more inherently able to receive or carry. So then they did their genetic analysis. And they discovered all of them had one particular gene which was in common, which was not there in those who had none, no psychic powers. And that that gene is known gene associated with certain higher faculties of perception or discrimination of the mind. So it's like the gene which is influencing the part of the brain or the function of mind relating to distinguishing good and bad or something of a higher nuance of value. So I don't remember the exact vocabulary they used, but to me it immediately suggested values which we associated with the spiritual. Of course, their problem was this: we don't know where this genetic mutation comes. Whether at all somebody goes through a rigorous training process of meditation practices, and as a result of change of consciousness, it reflects in the gene, or whether the gene can be inherited and as a result you have this ability. So they are stuck with the origination of it. But our perspective would be very simply that genes are repositories of the habit developed in the physical consciousness. As such, they do not necessarily limit the freedom of the mind. The point that Sri Aurobindo makes, and this is very important to understand, from a purely genetic perspective, when you see evolution of any species, the moment you find the genetic diversity reducing, the obvious conclusion is that this species is heading for extinction. Because it is diversity of genes which makes the pool of the species strong and adaptable. You narrow the diversity, something will happen, the whole species will die out. And what we observe is in humanity, there is a narrowing of the genetic diversity, suggesting, if you apply that logic, that humanity is heading for extinction. But Sri Aurobindo gives a different viewpoint. He says the human biological basis has evolved sufficiently that the further evolution of the mind does not depend on the biological change. And so what we are seeing is a transition from dependence of genetic change to give higher mental consciousness to the mind being able to come out on its own, as if stand back from the body and develop itself and develop its powers freely without needing to change the biological base. And so what you're seeing is a rich spread of mental types. And this is the point Sri Aurobindo makes. Instead of rich genetic diversity, you have shifted to rich diversity of mental types with a reasonably stable genetic base. So for us, from a yogic point of view, the fact that the consciousness opens to higher powers or faculties or inner powers or faculties and now is able to, as if, access them more freely, will represent itself eventually, first in the mind, then in the vital, and even in the what we call today epigenetic processes, where the genes do not change but the activation of genes change, and eventually settle in the most gross part of the genetic representation. But think of it the other way. If you have inherited that gene, it would simply mean if you made the effort to become more sensitive, it would be easier for you to do. Interesting. So it will be useful to have that, isn't it? But on an epigenetic level also you can have the same transmission, which means if your parents have worked to concentrate, to dedicate their lives towards a certain purpose, that also is transmitted. There's plenty of evidence to show that, and this is the recent series of experiments in rats. If a rat is exposed to a painful experience, their children who have never been exposed to that painful experience carry over that memory, so to say. And this is treated as an epigenetic transmission because genes have not changed. And it goes down 2 or 3 generations. So the rat, let's say, was exposed to an electric shock when it touched a particular thing. Now the children who have never been exposed to that shock, when they approach that thing, they have a fear. How did that get transmitted? A stress in the parents registers in the children and all the way to grandchildren. In the yoga tradition, in Ayurveda, we say the impulse stays for 7 generations. But at least we find here that it's there a couple of generations with the rats at least. But this is equally true, or more true perhaps, of the transmission of the positive efforts made by your parents and your grandparents and your ancestors. And you can see the value of a culture which values spirituality, or a family lineage which has valued spirituality, and the lift that it can give to you at a biopsychological level, the part of the psychology which is bound in the body. It's precious. And even if you don't have it from your immediate parents, you don't know, you might have inherited something from your grandparents or great grandparents who might have been extremely religious, but as a result built up in them a certain value and a culture and certain standards, something of which would still be gifted to you in the inheritance of the biopsychology range. But the way I prefer to see, and it's my personal viewpoint, but I think it's worth sharing, our parents are our spiritual preceptors. They're the ones who give us the new birth, the new consciousness, the gift of the spirit. And if spirit has a far greater influence and can more rapidly modify even biological principles, processes, then what we have inherited from the Guru is much more powerful, much more precious and effective as a gift than whatever we may have got from our biological parentage. In fact, the bulk of our difficulties and hardships are part of the biological inheritance in some sense, isn't it? And so it is helpful if we consciously turn our physical, biological identity and allegiance towards the divine. Make a conscious effort now to disengage from the inheritance of the biological lineage and turn and give and offer all that you are and all that you can be to the divine consciousness pouring into you and the Divine Mother and her Shakti. And opening all of you, including the biological base, to her, you allow her to infuse her consciousness into it and recast, reshape, light up with her presence and her love and transform with her love and her energy. And then we can say we are newborn into the spiritual life. And we can still be grateful and thankful to the biological parents for having given us that starting point. But increasingly you find very little of you now aligns to that inheritance. You belong increasingly and eventually entirely only to the divine. And the double evolution then takes a very different form when she acts from above. She lifts within and she works on the surface parts of your nature to lift from without also. We can dwell on this theme and meditate on it for a few minutes, and we'll continue this next Sunday.